It's my privilege to introduce Airisun Wonderli. She is a local resident, having grown up about 15 miles from Swannanoa, graduated from James Madison University with a degree in art education, and afterwards working for 10 years in the architectural field, designing everything from ships to houses to furniture. Following this endeavor, she has worked for about 30 years in graphic arts, running her own business, and most recently, since 2005, has broadened her creative outlets to include professional writing and art as an author and photographer. Airisun's recent publication of Swannanoa Palace, A Pictorial History, Its Past and People, was her second book published, and last year she came out with her first children's book with her own illustrations. Having met Leo in 1985 and 87, she has spent these years since studying the Russell message and their focus on a living philosophy. At present, with one of her passions being the Russell's message and Walter's vast art, she is working on her fourth book to showcase Walter Russell's claim to fame as our 20th century's Leonardo da Vinci, by showing the scope of his tremendous diversity in the fine arts. Many wonderful illustrations she's emailed me over the past few months too. You can get lost in just his illustrations alone are enough to keep you busy for a long time. Many new works, especially in the area of magazine and book illustrations, will be available and shown to the public for the first time. Airisun is passionate in her desire to reintroduce Walter Russell's artworks into the public eye, as well as into the high schools and university arenas. It's my pleasure to introduce, please welcome, Airisun Wonderli.
You know, Cindy and I always talk about being up here on the mountain by ourselves. So today, to have kindred spirits up here, it's just really, really exciting. This is our busiest time of the year at the palace, so I'm usually doing 2 to 3 tours up there per day. I always, you know, in the course of the day, try to sneak in more and more Russell information into my tours, you know, and kind of get away with it. But it's been really interesting how more and more people are interested in the Russell message from up there. People who come back, who have met Mrs. Russell, so many people. So Swannanoa will, I think, always be tied in with the Russell work. So today, what I want to show, I'm going to try this out. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of a living philosophy of the Russells and see where they came from to be able to have it all culminate up here on this sacred mountain. They always referred to it as a sacred mountain, and how they created their message to come alive from up here. And so, you know, I saw some of the talks, Richard talked earlier about how we can continue the message now and move into the future. I see this as a revival ever since I first started the writing of my book, which was January 1st, 2012, by the way, and really woke up that morning and was in about 4 hours of continuous receiving the messages that this was so important to bring this back forward again. So, and thank you, Matt, for having me here today. And I hope to show you a little bit about the history, but focus more on the Russell message and how they came to a living philosophy up here. So this is just the title page of my book. Bringing it forward, it's interesting because only late in the day when you take photos on the front of the palace will it turn blue. So just photographically, that's a little interesting thing. Okay, it's great. Just cover my book. Because this is always referred to as an Italian villa, I wanted to have that Italian look all the way through it, and really wanted to focus on where the palace came from. Talked about the Dooleys and Maymont who built it, but entering in the Russells because they were here, and we always say they had a presence here for 50 years. Half of the book is on the Russells. So if you get a chance later to look at the book downstairs, that would be great. I want to talk a little bit about J.B. Yount, and definitely I love my connection with him. He has more history on this mountain than anyone I've ever met, anyone I know, because it was his grandfather who owned the property and sold it to Dooley, and then connected with Leo, working 10 years on the Leo book and being her attorney all of the last part of her life. So I really want, if we could send some prayers out today for JB, that would be really great. I'm not going to spend much time today on the Dooleys. Tomorrow when we go through the palace, I'll spend a little more history on the Dooleys and why and how they built it, the way that they did, and how they saw it after they had built their 100-acre estate in Richmond. So just wanted to show you a picture of the Dooleys. This is Maymont in Richmond. I don't know if any of you have been there. A lot of history there. And really, when we talk about it in the tour, Swannanoa is really their summer cottage. At 24,000 square feet as opposed to 12,000 square feet. Oh, come on. Okay. You know, I want to talk about my favorite quote of Walter's, which is basically the foundation of the universe is love, balance, and unity. You know, and if you have these, the love and the balance, it really equals unity within yourself and unity with the world, you know, at large. This was taken from Leo's book, God Will Work With You But Not For You, and which I think was the best book that she ever wrote, and it was so well thought out. And so basically this is what she has listed as the basic foundation for a living philosophy. And basically what it is, what you sow, so shall you reap. So basically it's just the cause and effect. The cause and effect of what we're putting out into the world is what comes back to us. So that is basically how she listed it. The ones I starred are just, actually I noted that they were the negative or the opposite of what she was trying to put out. You know, one of the things, it's so interesting how I'm starting to see Swannanoa, the balance of the male-female is so obvious with the swan and the horse, because the swan was supposed to represent Mrs. Dooley and the horse was supposed to represent him. And we see that throughout the palace. So already, you know, unknowingly, the Dooleys had already kind of planted the seed of the Russells coming later, which I find fascinating. And also, I just, on one of my recent research, found out that Mr. Dooley's lesser degree was in philosophy. Isn't that interesting? And so I find that fascinating that it was starting to, you know, plant the seed of them coming later. Their coming here was so divinely orchestrated, even though they searched all over the United States for the mountain that that Leo had seen in her vision. And this was in her 1946 3-day illumination of her own, and how she saw that vision and came out right here over Rockfish Gap, and this was it. This was it. Now, the palace had been deserted for 16 years, and what they had to surmount just to move in, to spend that first winter here in November of '48 was just phenomenal. And it really tells you the perseverance that they had to see their vision through. This is Walter Russell's painting of Swannanoa that I didn't even know he had done until I started looking through the archives. Can't say enough about, you know, Charles Hardy's book about Walter, basically the Times articles that he went through and spending 3 years on writing that. It is kind of like the essential biography, even though The Man Who Tapped came much earlier. And what I hope that with my book of presenting his vast art to the public is going to bring it out even further how he started in his life. He was living, you know, the other thing is they were both living a living philosophy from the time they were children because they had that connection with spirit. They had that connection with God. They had that in common. So they were already children starting a living philosophy. Can't say enough about the Twilight Club. If you look at the Twilight Club, this was when Walter Russell basically was starting a living philosophy in the bigger world. You know, connecting with men and women who saw that their ethical practices in the world were going to show how that they could heal the world. And this was the seed of that. The Twilight Club became the Society of Arts and Sciences later, and Walter was always working with other creative men, newspapermen, authors, scientists, you know, groups of people and women, writers that could come forward and basically change the world. I mean, simply. This was what their intention was. The Society of Arts and Sciences kind of fell apart at World War II. And it was really difficult to start something else up. So this is why he always saw an Institute of Man. And here we are. You know, we're still coming forward in today's world. The Poets' Code of Ethics, which to me was kind of like the original ethics that the Twilight Club had in showing a living philosophy. So you can see this probably in your book on the Twilight Club, but definitely this is in my book, that you can see that they were already starting this blueprint of a living philosophy, at least in Walter's world at that point. The Man Who Tapped, with Clark bringing out that book, which was the book that fell into Daisy Stebbings' hands before she became actually Leo. She was Leo Stebbing before she got married. So he had actually dubbed her Leo in 1947, and because she had followed Lao Tzu's works very, very closely. Each of them studied so many different spiritualities and religions for so many years to be able to culminate and come together in what they discovered as a living philosophy. And you know, I'll show in a little bit how it seemed like Leo really balanced out Walter when they met, and definitely by the time they came up to Swannanoa in establishing a living philosophy. We're just going to briefly look through Walter, and one of his first living philosophies would have been the genius in every person. This was his belief system. Did he live it? Oh my gosh, he lived it. He lived it from the time he was a child. He was playing piano at 7, basically all the way through, master of all the 5 fine arts. He was an example to the world that he was living a living philosophy. And so really with the believing in the genius in every person, this was how he did it. Ice skating with Olympic skaters, being the best of everything he went to try. I love, this is probably my favorite photo of him painting. It's just on the beach. This was a school he started at age 16, you know, without, you know, a high school education. He quit school at age 9, 4th grade, and basically had to have been fairly self-taught, but he had quite a few mentors. He had musical mentors. He must have had some kind of study mentor to be able to enter this college at age 16 and take the entrance exams. These were some of his first sketches for Century Magazine, Collier's Weekly also. These are the types of illustrations that I am finding from 1894 all the way through into the 1900s. I've found 60 that no one's ever seen. This is the research that I'm doing right now, to bring all of his early works and all of his works, as much as we can find, out into the public. How could he live a life, you know, pass away on May 19th in 1963 be called the Leonardo da Vinci of the 20th century, and there are no books in colleges, no books in high schools of Walter Russell. This is, to me, it's just, I can't believe it. So I intend to remedy that. You know, became a horse breeder. Once again, you know, trying the best of everything that he could do. This was an ad in the New York Times about Walter Russell, audacious American. Really, he was audacious all of his life, I think. You know, his very, very famous Might of Ages. You know, so disappointed. He writes about it in several of his books, how he was so disappointed that he didn't win any awards in America, but then went to Europe, and this was picking up awards left and right. Because probably he had that global vision. And that's what this painting really shows. His first 3 books, I have 2 of them, and then I have 6 more first editions that a lot of people didn't know existed of his illustrated books. These were the only 3 that he wrote and illustrated himself. They're really priceless. Being kind of a connoisseur of children's books, you know, The Sea Children is just a phenomenal book. I just can't say enough about it. The illustrations in them it's just phenomenal. So these were really important. These were probably the last illustrations he did for a book. So it felt important to put those in my book to show people. These were actually in Frankie Wright's story of the Bible. And so in that Bible, he was along with Rembrandt and Michelangelo in, you know, where he should be. You know, all the illustrations of that Bible that, you know, were all the famous Renaissance painters. That's where Walter belongs. Architecture, you know, created $25 million worth of buildings in New York City alone, you know, not to mention the Florida buildings that he designed. Just phenomenal. This is the Hotel des Artistes in New York, which I can't wait to see and go inside. This is Alwyn Court in New York City. And then we get into him, one of his most famous painting as a, basically as a child portrait painter at the turn of the century, being hired and commissioned by the Ladies' Home Journal to paint the 12 prettiest children in America. So he was in the Ladies' Home Journal every month for like a year, year and a half, and showing, these were a lot of the, they said he had thousands of photographs submitted. I would not have wanted to choose the 12 out of those thousands of photographs that were submitted. These were the 12 prettiest children. These were, you know, small, basically small pictures of the actual paintings that he did. So he was commissioned, he was paid by the Ladies' Home Journal, and then they were given to the families. You know, so I don't know if we have some copies of those, but as far as USP goes, do you know that? Do you know, Matt? Do we have any copies of those? I think we do. Yeah, I think we do. These 2 here, we don't know who the children were, but Sam Spiker now has these in his possession. They stand about this tall. They're like basically living portraits, you know, size-wise. Later on, he painted notable people, Thomas Edison, Hudson Maxim, who was pretty well known. He had sort of gotten tired of painting children. He wanted to paint the wisdom of older people. So this was probably the last really commissioned portraits that he did along those lines. Becoming a sculptor in the Society of Arts and Sciences. The gentleman who was supposed to basically do the Edison sculpture backed out, and he said, oh, I think I'll try my hand. And then becoming sculptor to 3 presidents. You know, just phenomenal. Of course, famous for the Mark Twain sculpture. And then one of his most famous, I love this, is the 4 Freedoms. A replica was in the music room. We'll see tomorrow. We'll see the room where it was held. And then he basically you know, did the molds and had them up in the back gardens everywhere, each one. You know, he really wanted to put it up in Washington, D.C., but it never quite got there. But it was inspired by Franklin Roosevelt. The Christ statue, which they worked on together, basically had a huge event in 1950 when they dedicated the Christ statue. I was up here in 1985 and 87 when it was still standing, when I met Lao Russell. And it was quite something. It's, you know, and then piping in the classical music in the back gardens along with, it's just a phenomenal experience. Walter Russell's illumination in 1921, 39 days, 39 nights. If this isn't living a living philosophy, I'm not sure what is. This is him teaching at Swannanoa. A perfect civilization is one in which art, science, religion, and industry are equalized as the result of balanced thought and action. That, to me, is living a living philosophy, and that's what they did. The universal one, his connection with Tesla, his scientific paintings, which was someone, I think, out of, well, here we go, the physics department of New York University. If through painting you can express your ideas, I am inclined to think that you have found the basis of a new art. And really, he was so far ahead of his time. Once again, even all the charts look balanced and artistic. Then we get into Lao Russell, how she was born in England and basically was gifted as a child. She was selling her paintings at 10 years old. That's one at the top that she sold at 10 years old. So when they spent their honeymoon painting across the U.S., you know, it was basically they both were accomplished painters. She imagined at times, you know, being in Hollywood. Elstree was the English or British Hollywood. So she did do some modeling over there. This was her first husband. She was, you know, quite the world traveler. Her connection with, you know, even this with building health and strength, she was always into being healthy. This is how she incorporated a living philosophy. When they came, by the time they came up here, he was pretty worn out. So she really helped balance him with bringing his health back. And getting out of the city was a big deal, especially for him. To be up here in nature was such a focus. This was her house over in Elstree, England. She sold it and pulled out all of her money to sink into Swannanoa to bring it back. The beauty. Her own illumination, as I mentioned, in 1946, her 3 days, which was when she had the vision of being here on the mountain. Whoops. People that she knew who came to visit, and of course she knew Eddie Albert. If you look on the USP website, you'll see a 20-minute video there with Eddie Albert. He was scheduled to come see her a month after she passed. This is their lives at Swannanoa. This is when they got married out west, and really in the beginning thought that they were going to have their institute in Colorado Springs. And the reason, J.B. Yount says in his book, the reason that that fell through, he didn't feel and she didn't feel that there was enough nature where the road was that would go up to the property. So it was the lack of nature that she basically said, will you show me Swannanoa? He had already been here before. We believe his connection with Swannanoa probably happened through President Coolidge, because President Coolidge had come up here in 1927 and spent 5 days and 4 nights when it was the Swannanoa Country Club. He was a member of the Society of Arts and Sciences. So basically, my feeling is that he connected with him, was told about Swannanoa, and in 1937 wrote his 25-page prospectus on having an institute up here. So some of us have copies of that. The beauty of her at Swannanoa, it's my favorite picture down below. The people that they attracted up here, her really good friends, Amelia Lombardi, who donated a lot of money to USP. who's buried with them at the Blue Cottage, really sunk all their money back into the books, selling the books, getting their message out there, living their philosophy. After Walter passed, she was basically, you know, all over the United States, still teaching the message. You know, a lot of people said, you know, do you want someone to help you with this? She said, no, I think I can carry it on my own. And she did, and she really did. I have to say, when I first came up here in 1985, what struck me the most is that she talked about everything that mattered. Everything that mattered in life. The things that your family didn't want to speak about. Life, death, problems, you know, the secrets that you keep in a, you know, I grew up in a dysfunctional family. You know, to me, it was like a breath of fresh air because she would speak about what mattered most in life. Building character, being honest, you know, building yourself, your own person, being independent. And she believed so much in the equality of women. This is some of the articles that went all around the United States. Her speaking. I wonder how that one got in there. Sam Spiker getting married up there to Martha, but up above is Richard with Leo. Had to put that in the book.
That was Walter's 100th birthday.
Oh, was it? Really? Walter's 100th birthday occasion.
1971.
Wow, that's so exciting. How the palace looked, you know, they had 8 or 10 glass-top tables with all the history of Walter Russell. You know, so I'm going to have some pictures of what the palace looked like. John Denver visiting, so many people who were well-known, who heard about the message and the living philosophy and coming up here and being attracted to the mountain. That was, once again, when they got married. This is the view of Rockfish Gap that she saw. This was their dedication ceremony. They thought they were going to open in April of 1949, but they had to delay it because they were still working 20 hours a day trying to get the palace ready, but they had 1,000 people up there. And Darden, who was the keynote speaker, what the palace looked like with thousands of people around. Yeah, that was the official entrance in that period of time when the Russells were here. So gorgeous. The classes, the Blue Cottage close by where she used to write most all the time. 1955 when they were just up at the palace. This is what the baronial hall looked like with the glass top table in there. This was, you know, where I came in February of '85 and basically, she came down the stairs in her gown, and we had a big fire in the fireplace there. And just people just spread around, just wanting to hear her talk about the message. This is the library where they sold the books, and a lot of displays of his children illustrations. You know, it took a palace, really, and it never was called a palace in the beginning. It was Dooley Mansion. It was Swannanoa simply, but it was almost to me like it morphed into a palace when the Russells came, you know, because they always called it a palace, so I really couldn't imagine calling the book anything else but Swannanoa Palace. We talk about that in our tours, but it took a palace to hold all of his works. 36 tons of art that came from Carnegie Hall, 3 different truckloads. There's the Four Freedoms, which is kind of a miniature of the one that's in Madison, Florida. This is the music room, what it looked like then. Of course, the material's coming off the walls a lot right now, but really they saved Swannanoa. If they hadn't come, it would have been lost. Favorite picture of them looking at each other in the music room, the baronial hall. A miniature of the Christ statue, and then a section of the Mark Twain sculpture back behind it, which was basically put into what we call the breakfast room, which was all hand painted. When you come up tomorrow for the tour, you're going to see where the outline of all of those oval that is still there. Is still there, and I tell people that gives you an idea of how long the Russells were up there. You know, if you see that little faded oval. he always had his Hammond organ at the bottom of the Tiffany window, and he'd play in the evening for her. I tell people in the tour this, that he always called it romancing his wife in the evening, because they were both great romantics. This is the 20-foot antique table at the top where they would serve dinner right up there so that they could, in the evening, see the light come through the Tiffany window. These are, this is actually what we call the Swan Bedroom. They didn't use it as a bedroom. It's 25 feet by 25 feet. They used it as a drawing room. And so they had his piano up there, right here, and he would do, basically do recitations and play the piano. Here they are. So that's in the Swan Bedroom. It was a big room. They had a wood stove in there. This Lao in her bedroom, how it was decorated, which was not the Swan Bedroom. Love ye one another was one of the most important things that they had, of a living philosophy. They talked about the different philosophies, but especially the Jesus Christ, and he lived his philosophy all of his life. So love ye one another was always such an important part of their living philosophy. Teaching the classes, how the gardens looked, all volunteer people who would come up here and work up there. It was Christmas, a lot of the people who took the classes. This was the youth character rally in 1968. Thousands of people. You know, this is how many people she could attract. And being able to speak about character and building character and having that be a living philosophy. Because when, you know, young people are so impressionable, and if they can, you know, begin young, that's what it's about. Michael Hudak, Margaret Rue, working with her for 10 years, the last 10 years of her life. So basically, these are the books. I can't tell you enough about the world crisis, especially. That book up there, basically, and I want to read just a little bit from it. Got a 10-minute. So basically, they're writing how Jesus offered the world its greatest living philosophy, which charted a way of eternal life, as contrasted with the philosophies which charted transient ways of life for gratifying the senses and greeds of the bodies. One more I wanted to kind of finish up with. I wanted to finish up with this, but also there's a gravesite down below, them at Swannanoa. Go back to that just one more. So this is in their words. When the light of love within the human race awakens sufficiently to again let love come into the heart of every man, we shall again have a righteous age of character. Is the day of that great awakening now here? Has our suffering from fear and insecurity regarding life itself been enough as yet to place man before money? Or must man lose all he has before he will awaken sufficiently to open the door of life to love? So basically, I can't say enough about this book. To me, and they write about a living philosophy in kind of like 2/3 of the way through. A dynamic blueprint for the one way to peace and prosperity. So I do want to say that basically, you know, all of us are not perfect. You know, as far as the history of the Russells, when they met each other, he was very overworked. He was out of balance. He was not connecting with his audience. She helped him with that. His ego was too much there. When she came into his life, she helped him get back into balance to be able to live a living philosophy again. Because we all make mistakes. We all get out of balance at sometime or another, and sometimes it's our friends that will speak. History is there to know from our experience what works, what worked in our journey, what worked in their journey. This is what I get inspired from, what worked in their journey and their message. And then, you know, being able to look within our own mistakes that we make and learn from that too. She helped him get back into the balance. By the time they came up here and he was able to be and experience more with nature, he definitely came more into balance so that they could really fully live their philosophy up here. This was the perfect place because it was a balance of nature. It had the space to hold all of his works, and it connected them to the world. Thank you. Now I get to go up to the palace.
Want to take some questions, Airisun?
Do we have time? Yeah. We have time for a couple of questions?
I do have a question.
Yes.
I've heard anecdotal stories about Walter's, let's say, relationship history prior to meeting Leo.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all third party. Nobody seems really sure. Do you know anything about that from all the work that you've done? Was he married before? Did he have children?
Yeah. He was married. Still hear me, right? He was married. His first wedding, he actually got married when he was 21. And so he married early. He had 2 girls, Louise and Helen. Helen was named for the mother. And, you know, we talked about those 3 books that he illustrated and he wrote. He has so much of his girls in those 3 books and how he writes about children and how we learn from children. Not only do we teach them, but how we learn from them. This is so prominent in his illustrated books. After that, there is some stories about him maybe seeing someone in New York off and on, but he says, you know, and I quote, that for 20 years he was estranged from his wife when he met Leo. So I don't believe that he was living, he would probably visit them in Connecticut at times, but he was so about his work and his creativity that when he was living in New York City, it was all about that. Now, I do know that he met Leo in 1946, and Leo started traveling a little bit to hear him speak, and Helen, his wife, was with them in 1946, that whole year. But after she started coming and actually moved in 1947 to New York City to help him with his work, that was when they started falling in love. But he felt, and he claims, that he was estranged from his wife for 20 years, you know, before he married Leo. So she was around, but they had not been living together. That's my knowledge. Yeah, I don't, yeah. I mean, that's why he never divorced. He still had the 2 girls. I know they had a hard time with it. They pretty much disowned him. His 2 daughters, the daughters, had a really hard time with it. And even the general spiritual public, some of them had a hard time with it, but he was backed by Clark, you know, the author of The Man Who Tapped. They were both backed by him, and their really close friends realized that this was it for them. They had experienced, I mean, to me, it's one of the greatest love stories ever told. And if I could ever write a film to create that up here, it would just be a masterpiece. Yes. And to help bring the palace back, like a Downton Abbey kind of thing. But to me, it really is one of the greatest love stories ever told. And even though there were 33 years between them, it didn't matter. And she had, you know, I just read last night, I was doing a little more research, she had basically detached from having any personal attachment right before they met. She had let go of all of that, you know, and she was usually interested in different men. Men were always after her. And she said, she really writes, if you read the Leo book, if you read JB's book, she really writes how much she was not attached in that period of time when she met Walter. And really that was when it happened for both of them. So her background, her spiritual study, everything she had ever done came together to have the culmination of bringing their message together. This was to her, this was the spirituality that she was attracted to the most. And because of that, it brought them together, brought her with him to help get his work out there, to basically be a writer, help answer his letters, that kind of thing, and that was how it all started. Of course, up here we know she wrote like 100 letters a day. You know, the correspondences that she did. She was really like the marketer for their work and bringing it out into the world. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, yes, absolutely, because it's always
Yeah.
been sort of heard a little bit about it, but even in your book,
Yeah.
it's not addressed.
Yeah, I don't think he was seeing anyone. He was estranged from his wife.
Have daughters.
He had 2 daughters from his first marriage. But it's interesting when you think about it. The Dooleys who built this place never had children. The Russells never had children together. And the Delaney's together never had children. It's kind of interesting. To me, we are the children.
We have time for one more question.
One more question, Dan?
That was it. She had a
That was it?
miscarriage.
Oh, okay.
And she was fathered, the child was fathered by Walter when he was 77. Is that correct?
Not surprising.
Walter.
As I said, one of the greatest love stories, as I said. I think I have everything. Thank you all.
She was very proud.
I'm so excited about you coming up tomorrow. Can't wait to show you around. Thanks so much.